Thanks for coming to do tonight. Preliminary thing. So this semester we've been talking a little bit about discipleship. The disciple is, does anyone know what a disciple is? A disciple is sacramental. One finds their strength in the sacraments. A disciple is connected with others. So Jesus had his 12 apostles, Peter, James, and John stuck together, so we want to stick together. A disciple is someone invested in being mentored. The disciple seeks places, people that can invest in them. If we want to grow, we need to find people who are at that level who can help us grow. Does that make sense? A disciple prays more than the others. A disciple prays. A disciple learns, like coming from the night. And then a disciple evangelizes. That is intrinsic to what it means to be a disciple. And so that's where tonight's topic fits in. That evangelizing on a college campus can be really scary. It's almost like the fear is you stick your neck out just a little bit and you're afraid of how people are going to respond. Because you hear people talk about Christians and things like that. And so how do we do that in a way that's prudent and effective? And so our speaker, Tawney, he mentioned this as a topic, and I was very
I love this outfit you got going on.
Thanks, Rob.
Look excellent.
He currently is the vice president of curriculum for Great Heart Academies. He's familiar with Great Heart schools. But he himself has a master's in mathematics, so if you like math, you can, I'm going to say geek out, but, intellectualize out with that. He's even taught in seminaries in different places. He's married and has 8 children, lives down in Phoenix, and a little connection here. Remember a little ways back, a month ago, when I talked about how Father Dan Keneally's nephew had drowned, and then so many people prayed, and he ended up being revived, and is now home to the kids, and is back to normal. Jake is little Vincent's godfather, and so he has a nice connection with the Keneally family that live in the same community down in the Phoenix area. And so we were united in prayer, and we're grateful, as I know you are, for his healing. So please help me welcome Jake Tawney.
Wow, we're going to move that because that'll get kicked over. It's so good to be here. It's really great to be here. This is we're going to have problems with that. Let's move that down. A lot louder than you think. Okay. This is one of my favorite things to do all year. I look forward to driving through blizzards, dressed like I'm still from Phoenix, walking through downtown, my sweater's soaking wet from the snow, just to come talk to you. So I'm super excited to be here. Just a few things maybe before we get started. On behalf of the Robinson family, thank you so much for all your prayers for little Vincent. It was one of the most, and I'm not the parent, right? So I can only imagine for Wes and Caitlin. It was one of the most terrifying but amazing things I've ever experienced, right? The power of prayer. I think 2 years ago when I came here, one of my messages, it might have been earlier this year, I get all my talks mixed up, was something like, y'all, you need to remember that this faith thing is real. Like, that's the only thing smart that I have to say, actually, is that our faith is real. God is real. This whole thing is not a mythology. It's something real, and God is active in our lives. And when you go through with this family what they did, and when you see God's power acting, it's absolutely incredible, right? Not only the miracle, and I truly believe this. I don't know how much of this you know, but they had that kid had 52 minutes of CPR. Like, hospitals, doctors, EMTs, like, they don't tend to go beyond about a half an hour, right? They just call it. 52 minutes of CPR. He had no pulse going into the hospital. And all the medical professionals say, even if you come out of 30 minutes of this, even if, you're just a vegetable, right? The fact that this kid has no organ failure, clean MRIs, the entire church militants and the church triumphant were just pounding the Heavenly Father for prayers for this kid, and it works, right? It worked. This does not mean that God answers all of our prayers, but blessed be God when he does and when he chooses to act. It was amazing. And if you need any better definition, or at least part of a definition, of what it means to be Catholic, man, that's it, right? That's it. You got the sacramental life strengthening you, and then you gather as a church around something like this. The number of people who didn't even know this kid that were praying, like we were getting reports from whole schools out in Connecticut where the principal was like, hey, we're all stopping right now to pray for this kid. And like, they don't even know him. It was just amazing. So on behalf of the family and on behalf of me and my wife, who's the godmother, thank you so much for those prayers. Okay, so I was in another coffee shop down in Phoenix. I seem to spend the vast majority of my life in coffee shops. And I get there very early on a Saturday morning, and there's lots of great people at 6:30 in the morning at a coffee shop. But one of the great things that happens on Saturday at 6:30 in the morning is a bunch of Bible studies that show up. And for some reason, it just seems to be all guys. I don't know why that is. I don't know if the ladies just like wait till later to do their Bible studies, but it seems like I show up and there's like 4 different Bible studies going on. It's all guys. And this one tends to sit right next to where I sit. It's this group of guys from, it's a Protestant church. From kind of how they were talking, I think it's probably one of these non-denominational churches. And I remember them talking at one point, and they were talking about discipleship, and they were talking about the word apostle, and the leader of the Bible study said something like, you do know the word apostle doesn't actually exist in Scripture. And so I let this go for a little bit, and then on the way out, I had a conversation with that guy. And I pointed to the pastor. I'm like, hey, just so you know, out of curiosity, here's where it says this. And he's like, oh, what church do you go to? I'm like, oh, we go to St. John of Arc Catholic Church. He says, wait, you're Catholic? And that just blew his mind, right? What I didn't tell him is I did have to look up where the passage was on the internet before approaching him. But I want to talk about this. I want to talk about not necessarily the nature of discipleship, but I want to talk about this idea of apostolic mission. I do have a caveat for tonight's talk. I told you, the only smart thing I have to say is that faith is real, God acts in your lives, give yourself over to him, right? That's the only smart thing. Every other smart thing that I say comes from other people. So I just shamelessly, one of the two, plagiarize from other people. But in the Catholic Church, we just call that tradition. Right? It's okay. Paul did it too. He ripped right off of Jesus. So, it's okay. I'm in good company. If you don't have this book, this is actually a preprint. It's old. There's a nicer bound copy of this. I had this very early on. A very small. It's barely a book. It's like a long essay. You can read it in 1, maybe 2 settings. It's called From Christendom to Apostolic Mission. And the author is sort of unknown, right? Somebody knows who it is, but it's coming out of the University of Mary, and the story is that whoever wrote it just said, I really don't want necessarily any notoriety from this, and so the author, at least to most people, is not known. Monsignor Shea, who runs the university, his name is on the introductory letter to it, so that's the only association that we have. And so really, a lot of what I have to talk about comes from this. But I want to try to frame up where we're going with this, right? The whole idea here is to try our best to conceptualize, where is culture right now? And what does that mean for the church? And by church, just so we're clear, I mean you. What does that mean for you? You as a collective body that is representative of the church, but also you as an individual, right? So I promise it's not going to be like an extended, very intellectual conversation about culture, but I want to sort of go through this. But before we do that, right, I want to talk about what I mean. What do I mean about where culture is? I promise, I'm not going to start going through all the different cultural ills that are out there. I presume you know that. You know that probably better than I do, right? I might have a little bit to say about various pieces of it, but that's not what this is about. I really want to talk about this idea of cultural vision, right? What is the vision that the broader culture has, right? I almost want to use the word narrative, but I'm going to use that word in a little bit different way later. But what is the way in which the broader culture understands things, right? And what I want to point out is that culture always has a vision, period. That's just true. It's like any educational model. Every educational model has a vision. It may not articulate it. It may not even know about it. But nevertheless, there's a model of the human person that any education has, right? That's true of culture as well, right? So every culture has this basic framework that they use to try to make sense of truths of the world, right? And those frameworks can be quite different. And so I have just a couple different examples here, right? So one sort of very obvious difference in how we understand the world, we can find, and this is not the only difference with Christianity, but we can find between sort of the Greek mythological view of the world and the Christian view of the world. And there are lots of differences between that, right? Not just the polytheism versus the one God, the monotheism, but also even like the way in which the gods act and how we understand Jesus and God acting. Like, those are very different views of the world. And one reason we know they're different, by the way, and this is, again, while I'd love to go into those details, not the talk tonight. But one of the reasons we know, and we'll see this a little later, is that even when the apostles were preaching to the Greeks, it just wasn't received all that well, or actually it was worse, it was kind of misreceived, taken all the wrong way, because there's just this huge gap between those two worldviews. Another example I have would be something for you Lord of the Rings fans out there, between like the elven view of the world, and I actually put Sauron there. I think I really mean Saruman, but they'll group them together. And I also don't know if Sauronian is the proper word. I think I made that up. But let's actually deal with Saruman, right? So the elven view of the world has something to do with like receiving this natural thing as a gift. And here, like, I don't mean an environmentalism. I don't mean any of that, right? I mean, if you've seen the movies, if you've read the book, you kind of know what I mean. There's this way in which they receive the thing around them as a gift, right? Whereas Sauron through Saruman really wants to control. Like, it's not an accident that what Saruman is doing is really, in effect, it's like the Industrial Revolution, right? It's setting out to control the earth, like to control nature, to then build and craft and conquer. It's sort of very utilitarian. It's quite the opposite of gifts. Right? The elves understand that the world is a gift, and they want to give themselves back to that. I mean, there's this mutual relationship they have with creation, whereas Sauron's whole worldview is to conquer and control and take, right? But I'll point to another one that I think is more interesting for our time. It's the difference between what I call the narrative culture and a database culture, right? The narrative culture, which I think was probably in place up till about, let's say like 30 years ago, right? Maybe even 20 years ago. The narrative culture tries to understand the world around us in terms of meaning, in terms of understanding why. I don't just mean story, but I do think there's something about that, right? I think there's something about understanding us as part of some great cosmic drama. But I think it's maybe even broader than that. It really is trying to understand the meaning of reality. Now we have shifted, I think, to a database culture, which is another word for this would be a lookup culture, right? So one example of this is, I taught math for many years, and I noticed in the first couple years, 20 years ago, that if I would try to give like a bonus problem in class, like a lot of kids would go home and they'd start trying to solve it, right? And they'd come back and ask questions about it. And this is why I say about 20 years in, and about like 5 years in, I started noticing something different. Students would go home and they'd look up the answer on the internet. And actually like think they were doing something right? Like, I've solved the problem, I found the answer, right? And this is sort of how we operate now, right? If somebody asks a question about why, we sit there and we jump on our phones and we jump on a computer and just try to look up the answer, right? Again, not critiquing right now one way or the other. I'm saying that we have shifted. We've shifted from a culture that wants to see meaning to a culture that just wants the answer, right? To a culture that tries to solve over to a culture that just looks up things, right? And so that's what I mean about cultural visions. I just need us to understand that different cultures have fundamentally different ways of understanding the world and the human person and education. Everything that we do comes down to this sort of basic premise of how the culture sees things and tries to make sense of reality, the framework that they use. And that's going to be really important as we make this distinction between an apostolic era and an era of Christendom, or an era of Christianity. Now, within this cultural vision, let me just put like one plug for education. The whole goal of education, of liberal arts, right? Liberal education. I don't mean politically liberal. I mean in the old sense of like the Latin word liberare, to set free, right? The whole purpose of education was to free the mind. Not to free the mind to break you away from, say, a cultural vision, as if like tabula rasa, everything's garbage, go back to the beginning, but to free the mind to examine the assumptions, right? And to come to some broader truth, right? So if this is true, if every culture has a different way of seeing the world, a different framework that we use to make sense, what's required to move from one to the next? And what's required is a profound intellectual conversion. And that's going to become really important. So that's about as heady as this gets, right? I just want you to understand sort of framework, right? What we mean by cultural vision. Where the authors of this book, I think, are really smart is to make this distinction between an apostolic era. So think here of like the very early church, right? With the church is nothing, right? I mean, it's a lot, it's something, right? But it's very small, right? Compared to the broader world around us, it's very small. And think of how the apostles were acting and what they did, and we'll talk about that. And compare that with what we would call an age of Christendom, where the church is now very pervasively out, right? And what the authors are saying is, look, those are two very different cultures that the church is acting in. It's very different to act in an apostolic era versus an era where the church is settled, right? Is settled and people know about it and it's sort of everywhere. And the church needs to understand, and you need to understand where we're at. So we'll get to where we're at here in a minute, right? But if we just look at the practical differences between these two, right? So one could say, like, the obvious difference is that the apostolic era is happening where the cultural lens, that framework that we talked about, is not Christian. Like, that's what defines an apostolic era, where the framework is very much not Christian. People in culture don't even know how to make sense of Christianity yet. What defines Christendom is where the church is now acting in an era where the framework is fundamentally Christian. This doesn't mean that everybody's Christian. It doesn't even mean that most people are Christian. But it means that Christianity itself is kind of woven into the culture in ways that a lot of people don't understand. So do we get that, like that difference between those two eras? So what I love about this book is it does not say that one era is better than the other, or one era is easier than the other. In fact, the book explicitly says that's not true, right? There are things about an apostolic era that are fundamentally better and easier. There's a lot of advantages to it, but there's also a lot of disadvantages to it, and then vice versa for an era of Christendom. So, for example, some of the great things that come from Christendom, I'll actually start on the right there. I think it's easier for us to grasp, right? Some of the really nice things about an era of Christendom is that a lot of our laws and the way that we think about things are rooted in a Christian truth, right? I mean, there's no doubt that, like, especially in the United States, right? Europe and then the United States, fundamentally our laws were based on a Judeo-Christian view of the world, right? And so that makes things a little bit easier for us Christians, us Catholics, to act in. Because the culture is largely supporting Christianity, it's also things like parenting are easier. It's easier to raise kids in some ways in an era of Christendom. Because you can count on the schools supporting your message. You can count on the broader society largely supporting the message, right? So it's a little bit easier. People can practice their faith in openness and without fear. And then institutions, initiatives, Christian initiatives and Christian institutions, right? Things that the church starts tend to be more successful. Even in missionary countries, it tends to be easier to even get those missionaries started because your home country is largely supporting this, right? So having these sorts of Christian institutions are easier. I don't know if we have this on campus. Do we have any Knights of Columbus here? Like, in some ways, like, that can only be started in an era of Christendom. And it's notable that that's when Father McGivney started this, right? I shouldn't say only, but it's certainly easier to start those things when the broader culture is supporting the idea. So that starts to sound pretty good. Like, I want to raise my kids over here. This seems great. I want culture to support my faith. Well, look, on the other hand, though, in an apostolic era, hypocrisy is low. So what do I mean by hypocrisy? I mean, having this sort of lukewarm faith, or doing, maybe more acutely, saying one thing and doing another. Like, if this makes sense, right? In an apostolic era, the number of Christians is so small, they're on fire for their faith. Like, they have this total zeal. Like, imagine yourself in that early church where you've now bought into this idea that Jesus Christ was God incarnate and died for my sins and rose from the dead. Like, that's wild. And everybody's on fire for their faith. And so hypocrisy tends to be low. Lukewarmness tends to be low. The great adventure of Christianity is just felt more palpably, right? During an apostolic era, because we cling to the smallness of the church in that way, right? The standard of holiness is high, very high. There's a greater vocational sense of call, and then martyrdom, which exists in every age, right? But martyrdom is just felt more acutely, in fact, because the broader culture is actively martyring that small band of people that are coming together as a church, right? So again, don't want to mislead you. Martyrdom exists in every age, but it's just felt more acutely. There's a reason why we have more stories of it from the early church, right? Like, the world was literally trying to snuff out Christianity in a way that just doesn't exist when the broader culture of Christendom is supporting it. I'll give you a little sneak peek of where we're going. The question for us is, which side are we on right now, right? But let's talk about the downsides, right? So the downsides to the apostolic era is doctrinal and moral errors abound, because the church is trying to figure out in some ways, like, what does the incarnation mean? What is the nature of the Trinity? I mean, it's not an accident that most of the major heresies came up in the early church, right? And the church had to take a stance and say, no, that's heretical, right? Parenting becomes more difficult. Discouragement can become more common, right? Because you're not seeing the spread as much. You're not feeling it quite as much. It's not hypocrisy that's at risk, but it's cowardice that's at risk, right? It's harder to, because martyrdom is more acute. The flip side of that is cowardice, right? And then also I would say there's a temptation to retreat, to hunker down, just let the world go to hell. Also, again, I'm going to ask which side we're on right now, because I think we're seeing some of that, which is less of a tendency to do what we're supposed to do, which is to be evangelical and go outwards. Now there's a tendency to say, this is a smaller church, smaller faithful, let's sort of hunker down and just try not to get snuffed out. On the other hand, there are downsides to Christendom. Believers can become lukewarm. You can just become complacent. It's like you just know what culture's about and you're just kind of going on doing your thing, maybe showing up to Mass on Sundays, right? The great sin here in this context becomes hypocrisy. Because you don't want to be, if everyone's preaching Christ, you want to also do that, even though you may not be acting that way in the rest of your life, right? The church as a whole is tempted to lose its otherworldliness, that character of otherworldliness. That whole narrative of Jesus is just not felt as strongly in an age of Christendom. Priesthood can become a job rather than a mission, right? So we see this difference. This is not the only way we see this difference, but here's why this is important. It's important for the church and for you all to understand where we're at in this division, because it matters how we evangelize. It matters how we preach, right? And we can see some of this, not the Christendom thing, but we can see this different narratives in the Gospels as different preachers, as the apostles are preaching to different audiences, right? When Peter's preaching to the Jews, these are all from Acts of the Apostles. When Peter's preaching to the Jews at Pentecost, Keep in mind, like, the Jewish narrative is not completely foreign to the Christian narrative. I mean, the Jewish narrative up to that point was looking for a Messiah. This is not to say that every Jewish person accepted it. Like, we know that's not true. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that when they heard the message after Pentecost, it sat with them a little bit better. And we know that 3,000 people were converted that day. On the other hand, when Paul and Barnabas preached to the pagans at Lystra, right, to the Greeks, they were so rooted in their mythological narrative, right? You know what they did? They thought that Peter and Barnabas were Zeus and Hermes in human form. And they literally tried to offer sacrifices to them. And Paul was horrified at this. Like, how did this happen where all of a sudden they're treating me as a god? Like, I tried to tell them I'm not, right? Again, this does not mean that we can't preach to pagans. It doesn't mean that it can't be received, but it does mean that we have to change the way that we think about going about this. The third example is when Paul's preaching to the Athenians at the Areopagus. So it doesn't have quite the zeal that you find in the Pentecost preaching, but it also doesn't have just this like wild, let's offer sacrifices that you found in the Greeks. What do we know about the Athenians? They were extremely rooted in a very cohesive system of philosophy, right? This is why we go to those sources, right, for a lot of our philosophy. And so what was their response? Basically the response was a little bit tepid, maybe kind of questioning this, and to some degree somewhat mocking, right? Again, there's no judgment here, right? There's no even judgment about Paul and his preaching techniques. I'm just giving you an example that as we think about how we evangelize, how we act, how we preach, I'm just trying to convince you that the way that the world or the audience understands the Christian message, the degree to which it lines up, impacts their receptivity, and then should impact the way that we think and the way that we preach. So that's a little bit of my evidence there. Okay, now, what's so key, I think, about this book is when they make the claim, I think they're right, that we are in a new apostolic era. We're either just on the cusp of it, or I think we're actually kind of a couple, maybe like a decade or two in, right? So it's in terms of the grand scheme of the church, it's pretty brand new as a new apostolic era, but I think this is where we're at. I don't think we're in an age of Christendom anymore. I don't think the broader culture is supporting and understands the Christian message, right? Now, this is not the same as the original apostolic era. Right? We do have to reckon with the idea that this is actually the first age where the culture was once Christian but is no longer. Right? The original apostles had a different problem. They had a problem of people just really not even hearing, not even having ever heard the message of Christ at all. And so their call was to go to the four corners of the earth and preach the gospel everywhere. Right? I would argue the world has largely done that now. There are still some, but there's not nearly as many people who have just never heard the gospel. I think we are dealing with a record number of people who have rejected it, either because they once were Christian and actually left, or because maybe their parents they were pretty secular, never baptized the kids, so they never had a life, they've never been Christian, but still they know about Christianity and have rejected it, right? And that's a unique problem. Right? The church is in a unique position because she needs to bring back those who have left the church or rejected it. And C.S. Lewis says, as only Lewis can be in a pithy way, he says, look, this is like the difference between a young man courting a young lady and a husband trying to bring back the cynical wife that's been divorced for 30 years. There's a huge difference, right? That's not the same thing, right? And the church now needs to bring back people who have left. You've probably heard that term, new evangelization. The new evangelization is often misunderstood. Somehow it started meaning things like use social media to evangelize. This is not really what it meant, right? When John Paul II started talking about this, and when Pope Benedict continued that conversation, the new evangelization was the church is in a new position of having to evangelize her own people or to evangelize people who have left her. That the large number of people in the church don't know their faith, and there's a lot of people who've left the church. So this is a unique position for us, but it still has a lot more in common with the apostolic era than it does an era of Christendom, right? there are long-standing assumptions about what it means to be human that are no longer assumed to be true. They're now in question, right? Whether it's the question of abortion, right? What it means to be human. Like if we go back in history, like every source tells us that everybody understood this to be a life in the womb of the mother, right? We're now questioning gender, and then we're questioning other things about what it means to be human. Like, is it utilitarian? Is it just about success and progress and making a lot of money? Right? So there's a lot of assumptions that used to be true about what it means to be human that are no longer true. So the culture has shifted. Right? The culture is no longer conducive, no longer aligns to Christianity. Now, this is why I toyed with the term narrative. This is my belief, not in the book. I actually do think, even though I fundamentally believe that every culture has a vision, whether they know it or not, I think one of the problems with our culture is that they don't have an overarching narrative to that vision. So it's kind of, in some ways, taking everyone else by storm rather than them trying to make sense of the world, right? It's just kind of happening. There's no intentional thought behind it. And so in this way, it's actually even different than, say, the Greeks with their mythology. Very different, right? There's no real overarching narrative of meaning in the world, right? It's very vacuous. And I would also point that I do think there's something about the technological revolution that has been profound. And here, just so that we're clear, I'm not going to sit here and say, get off your cell phones and all that. I'll do that at the end. I actually mean prior to any of that. I mean, you want to know how much of a Luddite I am? I think things like cars changed the world. I think we may have been better when we were all riding on horses. Right? Think about what a car does. Where else in your life are you so close to somebody physically and yet not? There's this division between you because you're all in your own little world. I mean, think how close you are to somebody on the highway. That's a massive difference, right? Technological revolutions like wearing a watch has changed the way that we think about time, right? So I think it's not just technology like we like to think of it, like this thing and our phones. Even going back to the Industrial Revolution, I think this has changed a lot. I think that we don't have a lot of time for contemplation anymore, and that has only in part to do with the devices that have happened in the last 20 years. I think it has to do with a lot of the technology that's been playing out for the last 100 years, right? Light bulbs. Man, think about that. Think about how different it is to live by the rhythm of the seasons where maybe you get a little bit of light from a candle versus I can light up this entire room even though it's pitch dark out. This is just fundamentally different. We should just do a whole talk on technology. This would be great. Okay, I'm not going to do that tonight though. Okay, so lest you think I'm going to leave you without a solution, then we'll kind of try to get through this and wrap up. Let's even though we're in a new apostolic era, and I've made the claim that that's both the same and a little bit different than the original apostolic era, let's at least try to put ourselves back in the shoes of the original apostles and think about their solution, right? So let's just, and this comes straight from the book, right? Let's just imagine ourselves in that very first evangelization committee. That's what we'll call it. The apostles and their evangelization committee and what they do. And they have this charge, they know their mission. Jesus told them, go bring the gospel to the world. It's a very clear goal. Go do this. And so the apostles sit down, they're like, this is now the new board of the evangelization committee. What resources do we have? Well, first of all, they start to look at how the culture will respond, and the receptivity of culture is somewhere between ignorant and hostile. And then they start to think about the resources they have, and they get to this. It's we have 11 bishops. We haven't even replaced that other guy yet. We have the same number of priests, because that's us too. We have no deacons, we have no theologians, we have no seminarians, we have no seminaries, we have no religious orders, we have a few hundred Christians. Right? How many countries do we have that have Christians in them? Yep, it's just one. We have no buildings, we have no schools, no universities, we have no written gospels. We have almost no money. By the way, we also have no experience with evangelization, what it means to go evangelize the world. And one of the ways we might think about this is influential context, and like we basically have none of those, and if we do, they're all going to be dead in 5 years anyway because they're going to be persecuted. Now, what did I hear over here? We have what?
Oh, just, I was laughing about the countries with Christians.
Oh, I thought I heard somebody say Jesus. Right. Yeah, I heard that too. So we do have that. So we got that going for us, right? But like you can imagine, so that's a joke, but not a joke. Like you can imagine if they don't have their eyes on Christ, if they don't have their eyes on the Holy Spirit and the grace and the confidence that He will act in their lives, this is really depressing. I mean, like, who wants to go do that? Like, you're all in college. You're thinking about careers. Like, you want to sign up for that? And it would be so easy to be depressed and down about this work, but they weren't. They weren't because they knew what era they were in. They understood what they were and what culture was. And they were able to trust Christ to fill in the rest, right? So what is the solution? Well, the solution is found in part by just going back to that distinction, right? The solution is, in an apostolic era, martyrdom is felt acutely. So get ready for it. Be ready for martyrdom, right? And it's the former cardinal of Chicago once famously said, "I will die peacefully in my bed. My successor will die will die in prison, and his successor will die in the public square, being martyred." I'm not sure he's entirely right about that, but I think he is right about the way that everything's going, right? So right now, the martyrdom is felt in terms of shame and people yelling at you and like, why are you doing this Catholic thing? Like, are you really that silly? Like, it's felt acutely that way. So you are feeling an acute martyrdom in some way. But I think unless things turn around, several generations from now, we may be in an actual new age of martyrdom. And we certainly have martyrs around the world right now, but I'm talking about like on scale, right? So second, be ready to defend and explain your faith. That's the era of the apostle. That's what it means to evangelize. Be ready to defend your faith. You have to be. You can't be a martyr if you can't sit there and plant your feet solidly and say, this is who I am, this is what I believe. Protect yourself from heresy. And the best way to do that is to read the scripture and to listen to what the church says and to listen to Father Lowry. Now, Keneally's coming tomorrow. Yeah, I'm kidding. No, Father Keneally is great. And then finally, form yourself with a Christian narrative, right? What does that mean? Well, here's where I want to end. So let me talk about that. Because I'm a fundamental believer that the activity of the church starts in the human heart, right? It starts here with every one of us. The church is like crazy individualist. Like the church radically cares about you. Jesus radically cares about you and wants you to be who you are supposed to be. Right? The church and Jesus want you to be here, what you will ultimately be, God willing, in heaven. Right? And so start allowing that formation to happen. And if we want to understand what human formation is, we have to understand that the human is an integrated whole. We are body, mind, and soul. So we have to form all three of those. So, number one, for the body, I must have lost a slide here. That's all right. For a body, you have to establish a life of discipline. Right? This means fasting. But because we think of that in terms of the body, right? But you're practicing spiritual warfare, so you're ready for the fight. But it also means just the discipline of prayer. And you might think, well, wait, isn't prayer down in like the soul? Yes, it is, and we'll get to that in a minute. But discipline itself is a bodily thing because we live in time. We have to have that discipline of the rhythm of the day, right? As I think it's Father Larry Richards says, right? No Bible, no breakfast, no Bible, no bed. Right? What does your prayer life look like? And the single most important thing about your prayer life, maybe not the single, a really important thing about your prayer life is it consistent? Do you have a consistent prayer life? Is there a rosary every day? Is there evening prayer every night? What does that look like? And the church has a plethora of things available to you. But it's got to be every day. Discipline the body by disciplining and ordering your life. For the mind, I'm going to make a distinction here between the analytical mind and the synthetic mind. Not that they're different, but there's two ways in which we think, right? The analytical is the one that tries to kind of piece things together and make sense of it, right? And here, this is a little oversimplifying, but here I think of, like, you should read philosophy and theology. And I don't mean necessarily Aristotle and Plato and Aquinas and Augustine. Like, you should do that too. That's great. But I mean just like any article that is trustworthy, that's helping you to understand your faith and make sense of it and argue it, right? A book, an article, like something that gives you the ability to think rationally about the truths of the faith. You should read that. The synthetic way of thinking is the way in which the mind makes a broader meaning of everything around us. And I can think of no better way than to read good literature. I think people need to read more stories. I am very worried that our culture has lost such a narrative sense that we are on the cusp of not being able to actually, even most people, being able to understand the magnificence of Les Miserables. And the parallel and tragic division between Jean Valjean and Javert, right? To not be able to understand the difference between the good that's in Javert, the justice, but how wrong it goes and how misplaced it is and how tragic his end is. I actually believe in a post-Christendom era, people aren't even going to like that story anymore because they're not going to make sense of it. And I think fairy tales are going to go along with it. We're not going to understand fairy tales anymore. Read good stories, right? And then finally, for the soul, receive the sacraments. Like, that's how you feed the soul. Receive the sacraments. Plunge yourself into the river of grace by receiving the sacraments. Now, you're going to say, like, look, like prayer goes down in the soul, and like if you're reading theology, is that also not the soul? Yeah, look, like I said, we're all a whole. See what I did? This is my fancy PowerPoint here. I got circles and arrows. I was pretty proud of myself for this. We're a whole, right? So all of this goes together, right? As you discipline the body into an ordered life of prayer, that also includes the sacraments, it includes adoration, all of that. So this all goes together, and these divisions are helpful to think about because it helps us understand the three aspects of who we are as a person, but they all, of course, overlap at some point, right? Oh, I'm done. Look at that. No, so like seriously, like in closing, I do think it's important to note we are not in a culture anymore that is broadly supporting what it means to be Catholic. We're just not. Now, I think there's still aspects of it around. Like I think it probably, I don't want to make you depressed, it's probably going to get worse, right? I think certainly the fact that you can even gather here freely is a blessing, right? You're not doing this in secret in the catacombs, right? But I do think that we need to understand that we are no longer in the era that our parents grew up in, right? Where the institutions around them were supporting this. And as you go off, if and when like some of you get married, you think about having kids, Cardinal Dziwisz, who's John Paul II's personal secretary, is now in Krakow, he famously said, this is the first generation that is going to have to raise their kids more Catholic than they were raised if you want to save them and keep them in the faith. I think he's right about that. I think it has something to do with this transition into a new apostolic era. I really appreciate your time. I have no idea how long I went. I tried so hard, Father, really, to keep it going. I'm happy to take questions. Oh, no problem. I actually don't know the time. How much time do we have?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, great. I'm ready. Let's do it. What's your name? Atticus, as in Finch. A great book.
Yeah, in your slides you talk about the pros and cons of Christendom and well the Apostolic age.
Yeah.
It seems like the Catholic Church released that we increased by 1.4 billion Catholics worldwide. They were feeling a lot of the pros of Christendom and some of the pros of the Apostolic age. We're counting a lot of our losses. How can we keep these pros while also minimizing our losses?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So again, I think the claim here, I think the claim of the book, I think my claim is, I do think we're in a new age of an apostolic era. We are not in Christendom anymore. But I do think we're on the cusp. So I think that it's not like that's been a full transition. Again, evidenced by the fact that you're all still sitting here, and we're not in catacombs trying to do this in secret, right? And so I think you're right. There is still all these Catholics, all these new Catholics, and so the church is still growing in some ways, right? But what we are seeing is that the culture around it is starting to fade away from that, right? So I addressed that. Can you repeat the question at the end? What do we do?
Yeah, how do we keep our wins and how do we minimize our losses?
How do we keep our wins and minimize our losses? I don't think that answer is different than how do we act in this age, right? I think we still, if the question is how do we make sure that we're like not focusing on the losses and stay positive, I don't know, think happy thoughts or something. But if it's like how do we like keep winning and stop losing, right? Or stop from losing, I think that's a good question, right? And I think the answer is somehow not altogether different from the answer in the rest of the talk, which is understand the culture around us. I'm not a fan of hunkering down, right? I think we do, especially at your age. I mean, there's a way in which like I want to shield my 6-year-olds from things, right? But I think as students get older, go through high school, and then certainly by the time you're college students, you need to understand the world around you. You need to understand why people are questioning gender. You need to understand why they're questioning the truths of the Catholic faith. That's how we're going to keep winning, right? Is to make sure that it starts here, to make sure that we understand our faith, we understand the world around us, and we understand how to interact with the world around us, and then we have no fear and go out and evangelize. I think that's how you do it. There's another hand.
Stories you
next.
might want to recommend besides Les Miserables?
Books that I want to recommend, you want another 45 minutes here, don't you? What should you read? So you said stories, so I think we're in fiction, we're in novels. Okay, get your pens out. Ready? Everybody should read Anna Karenina. Everybody should read The Brothers Karamazov. I'm sticking with Russians for a little bit. Everybody should read Kristen Lavren's Daughter. Those are remarkable stories. They're long. So somehow a lot of things I recommend are long. Let me do some shorter ones. I think that you all should read Brideshead Revisited. I think is a phenomenal story of grace and conversion. Graham Greene's Power and the Glory, which is shorter. And I know everyone likes that one better than End of the Affair, but there's something really, really marvelous to me about End of the Affair, Graham Greene. A Tale of Two Cities. Holy cow. That's a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece. How do you... I'm going to make a claim here, and I'm so sorry that it offends anybody, but I think it's true. If you don't cry at the end of the book, there's something wrong with your soul. Seriously. When Sydney... Oh, you've not read it. You have to read that book. It's an absolute masterpiece. Look, I think if you want something that moves along real quickly, even though it's long, The Count of Monte Cristo... what a great story of redemption and forgiveness. That's just so good. Those are the ones that come like that, right? Moby Dick. You should all read Moby Dick. Do you know what Moby Dick's about? There's all this talk about it being about, man's, conflict with nature and all of this. And, yeah, maybe. Do you know why Melville wrote that? Because that dude loves whales. And he really wants you to love whales. And by the end of the book, you kind of want to get on a whaling ship and go whaling. You want to know why you should read it? I believe this is true too. You should read Moby Dick because someday, God willing, you're going to be in heaven. And when you do that, you're going to run across somebody who is a whaler. You'll be like, dude, I get you. That's why you read Moby Dick. Question right here.
So I understand that the area that we're in now, Hispanic, is definitely more like the Apostolic era
Yeah.
than the Christendom, and that makes us new Apostolic. But how do we know that it's new Apostolic and not a third thing?
Well, it is a third thing, right? So I think the description between, wait, let me say this two ways. One way, it can't be a third thing because of how Christendom's defined, right? Like the definition is a dichotomy, right? It's either the culture supports Christianity or the culture doesn't. So if you're defining an apostolic era as one in which it doesn't support Christianity, then it's one or the other. It's just a definitional question. But the other answer to the question is you're right. It is a third thing, hence the term new. I don't have all the answers for this, but I do think more thinking needs to be done. I think a lot of people felt this after reading this book. More thinking needs to be done, not about just the similarities between the two apostolic eras, but the differences. Because I think that's why I mentioned this, right? One thing that is notably different is just the obvious. We are not preaching to people who have never heard the gospel before. We are largely preaching to people who either heard it and left, or have heard it in one form or another, right? They may not have heard the whole thing. They certainly have not heard it, right? But they know about it, and they're actively rejecting. That is different than Paul going off to the Greeks and trying to say, hey, there's this brand new thing, and there's this Jesus guy, and by the way, there's only one God, so you were all wrong about that. Like, that's fundamentally different where we're at now. So the answer is, it is a different thing. It is a third thing. And I think more thinking and prayer needs to be done by all of us with what that means, and how do we take lessons from the apostles, but also adapt them to understand the unique situation that we're in right now. So I think it's a very acute question. One more? One more? Couple more? One here.
So as a father, especially nowadays so you hear so many stories about kids saying that they choose not to practice the faith, or they choose not to believe because they were forced into religion. How do you keep your kids in the faith in a way that won't make them believers?
I mean, I take them to Mass and I tie them down to the pew. That's not true. You're asking a question that is the most important one for a parent or somebody who's going to be a parent to ask. And you're also asking a question that is one of the hardest ones to answer because there's no guarantees. So I want to answer it. I want to give you some of my thoughts on it, but I want to honor that that's a really hard question. And it turns out, like, I wish somebody had told me this before I had 8 of them. Like, it's really hard. Like, parenting is hard. Like, do you have any idea how sinful children are? Parents are not. That's a joke. It's a total joke, okay? But no, I mean, like, parenting is really hard, folks. Here's what I tell young parents who are just like wrestling with the fact that their kid just threw a pea at them. They're like, I can't believe this. Like, my kid's probably going to end up being a pagan because they threw a pea at me. And I'm like, look, you are playing a game. Well, let me say it this way. You are giving them the best chance forward, right? That's in the actions you can do. Then you have to trust that there's the actions God can do, right? So what is the best path forward, right? They have to be raised in the sacramental life, right? They have to go to Mass every Sunday. You have to emphasize confession, right? I'm a huge fan in our diocese of the young confirmations. Now, that's not in my control, but I think it's super helpful for parents to have their kids have that confirmation at a younger age. And then here's the biggest thing. You have to actually have, what do I want to say? I want to say something scandalous. You ready? I'm going to take it back. I'm going to tell you what I mean anyway. I think that all families need to be cultural Catholics. Now, the reason that's going to be like, wait, what do you mean? Is it like that term means something different sometimes? It means people who like have this cultural Catholicism about them, but they're not going to Mass and they're not doing right. No, I actually want to redeem that term. I think being a cultural Catholic is a good and necessary thing, right? I think that's where kids get their identity. So I think it needs to infuse everything you do. I got news for you all. Like, if you think that God wants to be the most important thing on your list, if you think he wants to be prioritized above everything else, you are dead wrong. God wants to be the whole list. And that's very different than being prioritized as the number one thing. that has to be infused into the household, right? And you have to do that in authentic ways, right? So I'm a huge fan of the cookbooks that surround the saints' feasts. Like, that's cool. Turns out you can not do that and still be really, really Catholic, right? But I think the things that are on this side is like, you have to have meals together. You have to pray at meals together. You have to have some family prayer together. And yeah, the lives of the saints should govern your year, right? And then you need to find your own lowercase liturgies. Liturgies are really important. This is, by the way, why people stay Catholic anyway, right? People, it turns out they like structured liturgy, capital L, because they like structured liturgy, lowercase l too. It's like my family, we do this like crazy thing on Good Friday, which like has some roots in the Tenebrae services, right? Sorry if any of you have been to Tenebrae, but we do this on Good Friday every year. And then like my kids literally want to come home from college for Easter, like just for this, right? And so it's at night. So we've been to the it's not Mass, the liturgy, just call it liturgy, right? We've been to the liturgy on Good Friday, and then our church tends to have stations, so we'll go do that. And then we're at home and we wait for it to get dark. We say night prayer together as a family every night. So we say Compline. That's that liturgy, right? That domestic church liturgy. And then during the Compline of that day, we have the 3 candles that are there like at Tenebrae. And so at different points during night prayer, we extinguish a candle, and then you remove the 3rd one because it's the light of Christ. And then there's a big book that you drop when it's all dark because it's the thunder. Right? If you've not been to Tenebrae, you should go, and then some of this will make more sense. But like, it's totally wild. And here's where this gets like totally cheesy, and I'm so proud of it. Oh, by the way, any good idea that I'm telling you is my wife's. Sorry, I really don't know anything. This comes from my wife. My wife has, like everyone has creche sets for Christmas, like they have the manger scene. Like my wife has a tomb. It's so awesome. Like with a stone that rolls, like it's just wild. And so she's got like. She's got the risen Jesus that shows up on Easter, but like that's the thing. Like we wrap it, so we put it in a cloth and we spray cologne on it, and then like the little ones process with it around the house, and we're like singing the Stabat Mater, thank you. We're singing the Stabat Mater, right? And we're processing around the house. I got 2 kids with candles, and I'm yelling at them not to drip wax on the carpet, and it's awesome. And then we put it in, and then the little one rolls the stone. And then we sing the Salve Regina. And then they go to bed. And like things like that are wild. They form you. They give you identity. But, and then he's going to make me wrap up. So that's the kind of thing I tell young people who like are afraid of the kid that threw the pee, right? There's no guarantees, but you got to give them the best path forward. It's a harder conversation with a parent who's lost a child, whose child left the faith, right? And the answer there is you pray, you pray, you pray, you pray. And I heard a Catholic speaker say this once when he talks to parents like this. If you say, look, you know Jesus, right? You know that Jesus guy? Yes? This is a question for you. Yes? Okay, good, hopefully. And so he was God, right? And so as such, like he was perfect, right? Right? And he had 12 buddies, right? Yeah, even that guy didn't bat 1,000. He lost one. I mean, it turns out, like, even for Judas, there's free will. And that's the hardest thing as a parent, is to wrestle with free will, whether the kid's throwing the pee or, God forbid, leaving the church. And so the answer then just has to be prayer. You have to pray every day for the salvation of your children. This is actually your only job as a parent. Your only job as a spouse is to get your spouse into heaven. That's the vocation of marriage. And then united in that, you need to help get your kids to heaven. That was a really long answer to your question, but I don't know. You started with like, as a dad. I'm like, wait, I know this stuff. So, done? Good. All right. Thank you so much, folks.